Yellowstone is the birthplace of wilderness preservation. An extraordinary experiment, caught in the struggle between those seeking balance with nature and those who wish to conquer and control. Is Yellowstone the untamed wilderness of our imagination? Or are we unwittingly playing God in Yellowstone, America's Eden?
Here we have a chunk of the real world protected. And here we have a symbol of everything that's gone awry with the way human beings relate to the real world.
This is the world's first national park, after all, and we thought that idea up, but nobody handed us a cookbook and said, well, now here's how to manage the world's first national park, and so we've been sort of inventing ourselves as we go.
I know it's popular to say that visitors are loving the parks to death. But when you really back up and say, what's the long-term threat to the fabric of Yellowstone, it's really not the numbers of visitors. They are, in fact, damage each other's experience. And they can damage the resource, make no mistake about that. But the more serious ones right now, the ones that are irrevocable in many cases, are the habitat changes around Yellowstone.
Yellowstone is a place cloaked as much in legend as in fact, the repository of America's most potent wilderness myths. But what's the truth about Yellowstone? After all, people have made the pilgrimage to this area since the end of the last ice age. They traveled here in search of something. What were they looking for? What did they hope to find? One of those who came to the park in search of adventure, the wilderness, and the mystique embedded in the legends of Yellowstone was David Delancey Condon. It was 1929. Enchanted by the splendors of the park, the temporary visitor soon found himself wanting to be a steward of its legacy. David Condon became a national park ranger, and his mandate seemed clear: to protect and preserve this place for the future. Together with his wife Lorna and the family they raised here, Yellowstone was David's passion, matched only by his love for photography. Over the next 30 years, he shot nearly 12 hours of film documenting Yellowstone's wonders. David's unique films show us a Yellowstone when it was a little more wild, and the world was a little less complicated. He used his films at first to educate and entertain the public, and with his images, bring them to places in the park that they would normally not see. Later, he used them to document park abuse brought on by tourists and failed Park Service policies. 30 years after David retired as Yellowstone's chief naturalist, he remained critical of the Park Service.
I think that the Park Service is not managing it in the way that it used to be managed, that's for sure. And I think that it should be managed in a much different manner than it is being managed at the present time. The management practices that are being followed have not really ruined the park, but they have not done it any good.
For most of his life, David searched for the truth about Yellowstone, looking for the intricate webs of life that make up the ecology of the park. His story is about an American Eden of pristine beauty but it is also a tale about a legend that's dying at the hands of the people who love and care for it. David Condon never got a chance to tell us his truth. Soon after this interview was made, David Condon fell seriously ill. No longer able to speak, he offered his films in support of his claim that the park was severely mismanaged. Tell the truth about Yellowstone was his final wish. 3 days later, he died. Most of Yellowstone, America's Eden, is a high mountain plateau in the northern range of the Rocky Mountains. The young mountains have pushed up over millions of years, erupting at times in volcanic cataclysms, building the range and trapping its hot molten lava deep inside the ground. Today, the volcanoes lay dormant, but their legacy to this area still speaks of its fiery past. This is the largest geothermal field in the world, with over 10,000 active features and 300 geysers. The park's splendors read like a list from the record books. With 300 miles of shoreline, Yellowstone Lake is North America's largest protected freshwater lake. Among the rivers, the Yellowstone is the longest undammed river in the United States. At one point, it spills over a 375-foot ledge to create the tallest waterfall on the continent. Great Falls of the Yellowstone are twice the height of Niagara Falls. What makes Yellowstone spectacular and immensely valuable is the ecological diversity. In the high mountains, bighorn sheep find their habitat, and in the lush alpine meadows, deer roam. At lower levels, like in the Lamar Valley, there are the largest herds of free-ranging elk and bison in the world, and the occasional grizzly bear or gray wolf will make their appearances. Bone remnants and spear points from caves in the area show that these have been sacred hunting grounds of the people who lived here since the last ice age. They called it Mitse Adazi, which literally translates yellow stone, named for the cliffs lining the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. These ancient ones were Yellowstone's first stewards, and their beliefs live on into the present day.
Your Mother Earth, water, fire, and air go to make life. You must know how to use these four things in an integrated, synthesized way. When you do that, the more you understand the world about you, the more power that you will have gained. Remember that all these things, plants, trees, animals, are your brothers. So you must always respect your mother.
Yellowstone's curious natural wonders inspired legends among the ancient clans. Centuries before the white people came to Mitse Adazi, the Flathead clan's Coyote spoke these prophetic words.
For generations to come, this place will be a treasure of the people. They will be proud of it and of all the curious things in it. Springs will bubble up and steam will shoot out of the earth. Hot water will fly into the air, and voices will be heard here in different languages in generations to come.
The first foreign voices to be heard in these valleys were spoken by hardy mountain men and trappers, carelessly exploiting the animal richness. When they returned to civilization, They bragged about the hunt and told stories about a strange place where,
yes, sir, the canyons are so deep that one can holler in the night and go to sleep and be woken in the morning by the echo. Yes.
when they also added that the rivers were flowing with boiling water and that steam shot into the air from the rock, their vivid stories were dismissed and ridiculed as hallucinations. The truth about Yellowstone was still in the mind of the beholder. And one thing is for sure, for these early visitors, there was nothing sacred about the land they visited. Their hunting was just a means to a profitable end. As the westward expansion continued, the lure of gold drew ever greater numbers of people to the area. With them came writers, who through their first-hand accounts presented a more plausible truth about Yellowstone. But there was still doubt. The U.S. government commissioned 3 expeditions to explore the region, the largest under the command of Ferdinand Hayden in 1871.
The wonders of the Yellowstone were so great that it took all 3 of those parties to convince the American public that this was real. The idea of water spouting out of the earth 150 feet high was very strange, not easily believed. Hayden was the final certifier of these things, and he did that primarily because he had along artist Thomas Moran and photographer William Henry Jackson. You know, this was a proof that was the proof of your eyes, seeing the photos, but also Thomas Moran's artistic renditions were a form of proof.
Yellowstone was in fact so special that on March 1st, 1872, the idea of a national park was realized for the first time in history when President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone Act into law. The idea of a park large enough for a nation was an entirely new invention. What Congress intended to accomplish with this act was vague at best. Park boundaries were drawn to include only the geothermal features. This new stewardship had no provision for wildlife protection or park management. Critics complained that Yellowstone was simply a federally funded tourist attraction. They had a point. Hayden received $40,000 from the government for his expedition. He was also on the payroll of J. Cook, owner of the Northern Pacific Railroad. His survey was used by Cook to map the first direct rail line to Yellowstone. In Washington, Hayden's campaigning helped Cook gain control of the exclusive line to the park and all its concessions. For J. Cook and friends, Yellowstone's wonders were as good as gold. Within weeks after Grant signed the bill, track construction was underway. Clear-cutting to build luxury hotels and stagecoach roads to them was ordered. Poached wildlife were featured entrees on restaurant menus. Hot springs were dammed and made into spas. When the track crews invaded their territory, Plains tribes staged raids to defend their land. Angered by the delays, J. Cook took matters into his own hands. Knowing these native people depended on the buffalo for their survival, he developed an ingenious scheme. With the support of his friends, Cook set out to eliminate his obstacle by organizing a campaign to wipe out the buffalo. Early accounts estimate 60 million buffalo grazed the vast western plains, the largest herd of any free-ranging animal on Earth. Weighing up to 2,000 pounds and capable of sprinting 35 miles an hour, they were a formidable target. Shooting them became a sport. In the 1870s, 200,000 hides a day were sold in St. Louis. Buffalo hides were used to make coats and industrial pulleys. Buffalo bones were crushed to make fertilizer. In just 40 years, 60 million animals were reduced to a few dozen survivors, discovered in Yellowstone's Pelican Valley. Ironically, the buffalo was saved from extinction by the railroad tycoons who instigated the extermination of the species, but who also created a safe haven for the bison by advocating the Yellowstone Park Act, which outlawed hunting inside the park. The plains that once thundered with these vast herds fell silent. The rail line to Yellowstone was finished in under 11 years. The promise of adventure in the Wild West was a hot ticket, and the public was buying. Without park supervision, the first visitors, like the first concessionaires, were self-regulated. They did whatever they wished. They treated bears like circus animals. They stuffed mattresses into Old Faithful's spout to watch them blast in the air when it erupted. They poached game at will, and there was a great deal of vandalism of the thermal features. Reports of these excesses divided Congress. One representative called for the repeal of the Yellowstone Act, arguing that the federal government should get out of the circus business. By 1886, abuse was so widespread, the Secretary of the Interior had to call on the Secretary of War to intervene. In August of that year, Captain Moses Harris and 50 troops of the U.S. Cavalry rode into Mammoth Hot Springs to restore law and order. 3 years earlier, on September 10, 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad hosted a celebration to drive the last spike in their exclusive line to Yellowstone. Crow Chief Iron Bill was invited to address the crowd.
This is the last thing for me to do. There's a meaning in my part of the ceremony, and I understand it. The end of our lives is near at hand. The days of my people are numbered. Already they are dropping off like the sun in the western sky. Of our once powerful nation, there are now few left, and we too will soon be gone.
While the West was won, much was lost. The buffalo, the first Americans, and the last wild lands in the West. The movement to repeal the Yellowstone Act was gaining momentum. It looked like the world's first national park might also be its last. Over the next decade, the debate was fierce between those who wanted to protect the sanctuary and those who wanted free access for their continuous exploitation. And the railroad barons were on both sides of the fence, promoting Yellowstone as the new wonderland, while railroad tracks slithered like the serpent in Eden. Anticipating a paradise lost, the railroad owners panicked in the face of diminishing returns. In 1903, the Northern Pacific Railroad Board of Directors enlisted the support of Yellowstone's most famous advocate, President Teddy Roosevelt, who visited the park several times.
Surely our people do not understand even yet the rich heritage that is theirs. There can be nothing in the world more beautiful than the wonders of Yellowstone, and our people should see to it that they are preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty unmarred.
There was no arm, no effective agency to administer the parks. And it became apparent in the teens that we needed such an agency. In 1916, the newly formed National Park Service was dispatched to Yellowstone and other national parks to begin taking over the parks from the Army's administration.
Dressed in the World War I Army uniform, on September 30th, 1916, 22 enlisted men stationed at the park were discharged from the Army and immediately inducted into the National Park Service as the park's first rangers. After 32 years running Yellowstone, the Army officially relinquished their command at Fort Yellowstone to the National Park Service.
And Congress mandated the new National Park Service to do a number of things. They said you rangers must conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects in the park, and you must manage them in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for future generations. And that was a very visionary, sort of a high-sounding ideal. But that was really the only thing we had to go on.
Acting on their dual mandate, the new stewards of Yellowstone's legacy put their efforts into what they did best: They approved expansion of the park's luxury hotels and organized tourist activities. They promoted boating on the pure waters of Yellowstone Lake. Park rangers became tour guides. But didn't the authorities realize they were putting the rich wildlife in Yellowstone at risk? Didn't the rangers react to the destruction? The truth is, wildlife conservation as we know it today was at this time hardly invented anywhere in the world. The Earth was still a seemingly immeasurable place abounding with resources to be exploited. Conservation was everywhere a romantic notion of saving the grand landscapes of the world. The Park Service limited their conservation to Yellowstone's geothermal fields. Expanding protection to the park's extensive wildlife seemed unnecessary. Despite their preparations to make Yellowstone more accessible, they were still completely unprepared for the profound change on the horizon, fueled by the early 20th century's most revolutionary invention, an invention so popular it would forever change how Americans would experience Yellowstone. Ironically, it was in an old jalopy like this that David Delancey Condon first saw Yellowstone. When he arrived in 1929, the Park Service was no longer hiring rangers just to be tour guides. They were also looking for men trained in the natural sciences. Camera in hand, David's journey for the truth about Yellowstone had begun. He arrived in the park as the biologists working out of the Roosevelt Experimentation Station were publishing their first papers on Yellowstone's native plants and wildlife. Even though a more modern conservation view started to penetrate the system, the biologists and rangers saw their stewardship as regulating one species after the other. The dual mandate forced the Park Service to play God and decide which animals could live and which had to die. The large grazing animals were what people came to see, and these animals were conserved at any cost. Because predators threatened these herds, they were considered a pest. One of the Park Service's first official activities was to quietly support the U.S. Biological Survey in their program to exterminate the mountain lion and the gray wolf. Between 1915 and 1941, 24,000 wolves were killed in the American West. During their first decade, the Park Service issued hundreds of permits to hunt, trap, or poison wolverines, badgers, lynx, coyote, mountain lions, and wolves. During these years, the Park Service sponsored the killing of the last 136 gray wolves inside the park. These are the pups of the last female to die in Yellowstone. Tourists were allowed to play with them before they were drowned. By 1926, they had the pest problem under control. With one less problem to worry about, the stewards of Yellowstone's resources were in for a rude awakening. Lacking the proper knowledge of species interaction, they were ignorant of the workings of Mother Nature. During the 1920s, thousands of elk and bison were dying of starvation during Yellowstone's notoriously harsh winters. The Park Service feared the grazing animals faced extinction. A winter feeding campaign was implemented, concentrating the herd in a small area. The result? A total devastation of the park's northern range. A 1928 study showed half the area had been browsed to stubble over the last 10 years. Something had to be done. David headed an effort to study the overgrazing. The growth inside these fences show what the vegetation would look like without elk and bison. No doubt, the large herds had a profound effect on the total ecosystem. With native aspen and willow stands disappearing along the riverbanks, beaver populations were in decline. As the beaver disappeared, an ecological disaster of unprecedented magnitude presented itself. Wetlands dried up, runoff increased, speeding up erosion, which in turn silted the pristine waters and destroyed the spawning grounds for trout. The beaver dams had provided for waterfowl habitat and vital hunting grounds for otters and mink. With beaver dams gone, riverbanks dried up, and essential food plants wilted away. The grazing animals were caught in a vicious circle. Scientists were beginning to piece the ecological puzzle together, and they concluded the elk and bison were in trouble because too many animals were concentrated in a small area that lacked winter range. And they proposed an even more radical theory, that a decline in natural predator populations might have something to do with the exploding numbers. David Condon's truth about Yellowstone was grim. Yellowstone's natural systems were failing. David was appointed assistant park naturalist in 1939, and he became more zealous in protecting the park's resources. In February of that year, he spent 2 weeks skiing from park headquarters in Mammoth to the thoroughfare district at the opposite end of the park, tracking down and catching poachers. But abuse in the wintertime, when the park was officially closed to all visitors, was nothing compared to what happened once the gates opened to the crowds that spring. Vandalism was nothing new. It was part of the Yellowstone legacy, but record numbers of visitors were vandalizing park features at an unprecedented rate. In a report, David concluded,
"This heavy impact has wrought its effect on all the park's features, from the flora and fauna to the mountains themselves. The compounding effect of human impact is applicable to virtually all of Yellowstone's resources."
111 items were pulled out of Morning Glory Pool that year. They included beer cans, an engagement ring, candy wrappers, bath towels, tax tokens, and $86.27 in pennies. In 1941, the country was thrust into war. Crowds suddenly vanished. Hotels were closed, and guided tours were canceled. For the first time in 70 years, the public demand on the park declined, and the park could rest. The rest was to be short-lived. During the first years of the nuclear age, Americans drove to Yellowstone in record numbers and made the vacation an art form. The first year, park attendance soared above the 1 million mark was 1948. After an honorable discharge from the Navy, David returned to the Park Service uniform as Yellowstone's chief naturalist. In their post-war mission statement, the Park Service declared their new vision as Yellowstone's stewards. The Park Service promised to, quote, promote the preservation of the park's natural resources, perpetuate and portray as a composite whole the indigenous terrestrial fauna. While perpetuating the indigenous terrestrial fauna was their official stance, their actions told a much different story. Elk numbers were still 4 to 5 times what the winter range in Yellowstone could handle. Biologists produced proof that these unnaturally large populations were due in part to the fact that the elk's dominant predators, gray wolves and grizzlies, were no longer culling the herd. So the Park Service officially assumed the predator's role. Dehorned animals were transported out of the park. Others were simply killed. The exodus was part of a simple wildlife management strategy, which favored the expansion of tourist services for the record-setting visitation, rather than understanding the complex ecology of the park and making adjustments in the management. The inherent conflict in the Park Service's mandate to protect park services while promoting public access has traditionally been biased by public demand. This bias would prove fatal to the park's grizzlies.
Well, if a place has grizzlies in North America, it's like it always was. And those are the most important landscapes of all. And you know, you can measure them any way you want, but basically if you don't have a grizzly there, it is not, you know, the primal landscape that Europeans encountered when they first saw this country a couple hundred years ago.
Historically, bears have been at the top of the food chain in the ecosystem throughout the western United States. But for nearly a century, Yellowstone has been one of their last refuges. An incredibly efficient hunter, the omnivorous grizzly prefers berries, roots, seeds, and insects in Yellowstone's remote highlands. From the beginning, bears were part of the Yellowstone experience. This innocent contact had its consequences. Over the years, nearly 4,000 serious injuries and 5 deaths due to bear attacks have been reported in Yellowstone. Contributing to their diminishing numbers, the Park Service killed bears that attacked people, and every year dozens of bears became fatalities on Yellowstone's overcrowded roads. For decades, the Park Service operated public dumps for the crowd-pleasing grizzly feeding shows. Despite these feasts, Chief Naturalist Condon uncovered disturbing news in the 50s. Bear numbers were plummeting. Research showed human handouts diminished their interest in hunting. Grizzlies, habituated to human fast food, weren't making it through the winter once the tourists went home and the dumps were closed. But the Park Service would not take countermeasures without proof, and they wouldn't fund the study that would document his claim. In 1954, David asked independent researcher Dr. John Craighead to study the Yellowstone grizzly. This upset the park superintendent. He did not want news of a declining bear population leaked to the public. It would be bad for business. Public opinion meant so much to the Park Service because Yellowstone earned more in gate revenue than any other national park. In fact, for decades, other parks couldn't open without the subsidy from Yellowstone's income. So in the 50s, the Park Service responded to public demand for bigger and better tourist services. They unveiled their most ambitious plan ever, Mission 66. Mission 66 was to upgrade Yellowstone's crumbling infrastructure and add new facilities by 1966. The program included the construction of 2 huge resort complexes. By 1958, Canyon Village was open for business. Plans for Grant Village were delayed temporarily because it was to be built in prime grizzly habitat. While Yellowstone continued to be promoted as America's Wonderland, the Park Service's stewardship even resorted to chemical warfare, spraying DDT on the park's wildlife. But David Condon saw another threat on the horizon.
The increased travel during the past season has brought many thousands of people who have not been exposed to the ideas, ideals, and significance that these great areas have for them. Abuse of the thermal areas has increased, and some features have suffered irreparable damage at the hands of thoughtless individuals. Their protection and preservation is the paramount reason for there being this Yellowstone National Park, and anything we can do to assure their continued well-being will not be too much.
At this time, Condon was continuously arguing his case, writing articles to alert the public. Based on his reports to the administration, He was opposing the Park Service's agenda to expand the tourist services at the expense of the park wildlife. Counting Chief Naturalist Condon, only 10 field rangers were conducting research in Yellowstone with an annual budget of $28,000, less than the cost of a single campground bathroom. David's message, his truth that Yellowstone was being mismanaged by foolhardy bureaucrats, made him a target. In typical fashion, rather than heed the message, they killed the messenger. In 1959, after 30 years of devoted service to Yellowstone, David was reassigned. He was made Assistant Superintendent of the Great Smokies National Park in Tennessee. While Park Service administrators rededicated themselves to Mission 66, David had evidence the park was dying. And the American public never suspected a thing. All this changed in the 1960s when the Craighead Grizzly study confirmed David's prediction. At the current rate of extinction, the grizzly would die out in the park within 20 years. As news of this leaked to the public, they became disenchanted as evidence surfaced of chronic vandalism, chemical and sewage spills in the park, and DDT use. The springs fell silent as birds and entire ecosystems were impregnated with chemical pesticides. It triggered, in the early 60s, a new era in environmental consciousness worldwide. The Park Service was not ignorant of this change, and a new accountability was required of the Park Service as Yellowstone's stewards. For the first time in its history, the Park Service had to consider their entire mandate to conserve the resource as well as serve the public. Open-pit garbage dumps were closed, laws made it illegal to feed the bears, and the bears were removed to the backcountry. By 1972, Yellowstone's centennial, the Park Service launched plans to implement a new policy called natural regulation. Natural regulation sounds simple enough. Let nature take care of itself. But that's easier said than done in an ecosystem where management had already altered so many natural processes. But for many, the notion of a hands-off policy was seen as a threat to established management routines. Both sides locked into battle. Critics of the natural regulation policy argued the park would die without continued intervention. They saw the policy as a rationale for doing nothing and a means to stifle debate on conservation issues. Supporters insisted natural regulation was the only way the park would survive the scars of failed management policies, that only nature could restore a damaged ecosystem to its primeval state. While each side drew lines in the sand, neither was prepared for how natural regulation would be put to the test in 1988. 1988 was the driest summer in the park's history. When a single bolt of lightning touched off the first fires of the season, it was just one of 249 fires that would burn that summer. The lightning bolt was nature's way, but the truth was that 40% of the fires that summer were carelessly set by tourists. Most of the fires would die out by themselves, having blazed through only small areas, but some would grow into monsters. The natural regulation policy said, let it burn. And the fires soon raged through valleys and forests, finally burning 40% of the park's area. Media reports flooded the airwaves, reporting the fire as the biggest tragedy in the history of the park. Hundreds of animals were dying. Yellowstone would never recover from this devastation. With historic buildings at risk, fires approaching nearby towns, and the obvious risk of losing future tourist dollars, authorities lost the courage of their convictions and abandoned the let it burn policy. The dollars burned as fast as the forests. 10,000 firefighters risked their lives at the cost of $120 million, and at the end of the day, their efforts did not significantly reduce the burned area. The nation was divided. Many Americans criticized the Park Service for having destroyed America's Eden. The Park Service fought back. They joined conservation groups in a campaign to educate the public about the ecological roles of fires. The patchiness caused by the fire is nature's way to create diverse and unevenly aged forests. Unlike clear-cutting, fire checkerboard patterns leave large stands undisturbed to reseed the new forest. Fire is the first step in a forest's rejuvenation. The natural mechanism needed to release the seeds from lodgepole pine cones. The fire is not the destructive end of a life cycle. It's the genesis in America's Eden. And soon it all bloomed again.
It was an event that created broad-scale ecological change within the park, but certainly not destruction. This is one of the major processes that we have to protect when we're talking about protecting wilderness. We're not just talking about protecting a snapshot of a landscape at a certain instant of time. We have to be talking about protecting the processes that create this dynamic, changing landscape. It was really an incredible thing that we should really consider ourselves lucky to have experienced in our lifetime.
No one denies interpreting the natural regulation policy is difficult, but the fires ultimately forced both opponents and advocates to rethink their positions. For the Park Service, and most definitely for conservation advocates, it was now absolutely clear that the natural regulation policy could never work without the presence of the most charismatic players in nature's grand design in Yellowstone. The Park Service has come full circle. 70 years after their eradication of Yellowstone's great hunter, it was making its return. The wolf has a special place in Yellowstone as predator and as legend. For the Shoshone, Wolf Brother created this place. For others, the wolf is a symbol of our vain tinkering with nature. For the Park Service, restoring the wolf to its proper place in Yellowstone restores the ecosystem to its original balance and gives natural regulation its first real chance to work. Bringing the wolf back also rights a wrong in their legacy of stewardship.
The wolf is a keystone species. With wolves here, Yellowstone and the ecology of Yellowstone will be fundamentally different than without wolves. And that applies to the elk and the moose and the bison that they prey on, the relationships that wolves have with coyotes, that coyotes have with mice, that mice have with grass, and that mice have with hawks and owls. It permeates the entire system.
In January of 1995, after years of legal, political, and social battles, 14 gray wolves were captured in Canada. Like all modern conservation stories, restoring the wolf to Yellowstone is highly controversial, and as the wolves were transported through the Roosevelt Arch, the debate raged on. But the Park Service stayed firm and loyal to its interpretation of the natural regulation policy. The wolves were transported further into the Yellowstone backcountry, their new home. Those opposed to the wolf's return believe we are repeating history and playing God all over again. Supporters believe the wolf will bring the elk and bison populations into natural balance, and this in turn could rejuvenate the northern range. The wolves quickly made the Lamar Valley and other areas their hunting grounds. After a 70-year absence, these are the first images of the new pack's early hunting experiences in Yellowstone.
We all, I think, intuitively understand that a completely civilized or tamed world is a dead world. And we need that unpredictability. We need that sense of the uncontrollable. And even though wolves don't necessarily threaten us in any way, they do provide that otherness, that sense of something that perhaps we've given up. And I think that's why, in many ways, we long for them, we respond to them, we react in such a instinctive way to their howl. So I think the act of restoring that wildness to one of the only remaining wild places in the lower 48 is truly and deeply profound cultural act.
So what is the truth about Yellowstone? Have we progressed since the railroads first exploited the park as a tourist destination? Or is history repeating itself? Have we forever transformed a wilderness wonderland into a wilderness theme park, where visitors pay their fee to get a quick fix of natural wonders without ever having to step far away from the comfort and security of their cars or snowmobiles? Or is Yellowstone blessed by this human ignorance? After all, 90% of the people driving here only see 5% of the actual park, leaving the backcountry for those who wish to experience the true wonders of Yellowstone. The wildness along paths and rivers, a place that can only be experienced on nature's own terms.
These remnants that we call wilderness today are what our species evolved with, what we lived with until a couple hundred years ago on this continent rather. And I think it's worth everything to fight to keep a few of those places. And they are things which are by definition beyond our control, beyond our culture, beyond our notions of dominion or anything else.
David Condon's films have helped us glimpse his truth about Yellowstone. That for years Yellowstone has been embroiled in the conflicted mandate of a park service that vacillates between conserving the park and exploiting it for public consumption. His truth is that Yellowstone will not survive this paradox. If Yellowstone is America's Eden, then a premium must be placed on wildlife habitat. The park was once established as an invisible island in the vast wilderness of the American West. Today, its sharp-edged boundaries set it aside from the exploited surroundings. Once an imaginary boundary, it is now an obvious line of demarcation, imprisoning the wilderness in an artificial enclosure. For natural regulation to work, animals must be set free and allowed to roam their natural range. The park boundaries must be redrawn to include the mostly public lands surrounding the park. Known as the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, these 18 million acres are the last buffer between Yellowstone's wildness and civilization.
100 years from now, if we look at the trend of society, places like Yellowstone or smaller places are going to be of the same value of Central Park. If you ask a New Yorker today about the value of Central Park, they'll say, you can't put a value on it. Well, the reason they say that is because men and women years ago had the foresight and the fortitude to work to preserve that.
In the end, Yellowstone is our test. Will we be able to adhere to the principles of the Native American faith, to understand that power is granted to those who will respect and protect not only the landscape, the plants and the animals, but also the intricate processes that govern life and death? Will we have the vision to preserve Yellowstone, the world's first national park, and a grand experiment in human stewardship for our children and our children's children? Or will we trade the park's future for our short-term gratification? The truth about Yellowstone is that it is not merely an island of our own invention called a national park. It is a microcosm of a larger island, the one we call home.